This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So thank you so much for the invitation, Miriam, to speak here again. I feel like I've been let off easily. I think the hard work is going to be done by Claire tomorrow, not all day tomorrow. So it's a great pleasure to sit here and talk with you. And thank you very much. That's super. I'm going to bring it back to the beginning. Okay. So today I'm going to talk primarily about the research project that myself and Hilary Marland are working on, which is very much focusing on the relationship between prisons, reform, different prison regimes, and mental health in the 19th and 20th centuries in England and Ireland. And I'm not going to cover that whole topic today, but what I would like to do is introduce you to the project itself, say a few words about the project, which is quite big and I sometimes think utterly overambitious, and then talk more specifically about the research we are currently engaged in at the moment. So the overall project is basically looking at, it's a Welcome Trust Senior Investigator Award, so we're very lucky to have that source of funding. And it started in 2014/15 and will run to about 2019, or probably further on than that. And as I said, it's led by myself and Hilary. And what we're interested in looking at is prisons and the relationship to prisoners, medical care and entitlements, if such a word can be used, to health in quite a broad period in the 19th and 20th century. Why prisons, you may ask? Why would you look at prisons in relationship to health? Well, as you know, during his brief imprisonment in Reading Jail in the late 1890s, Oscar Wilde criticised prison medical officers as being as of a class of ignorant men, and he sought the introduction of, quote, experts who understood brain disease and people of humane feelings who still have some common sense and some pity. The prison, Wilde added, had poor arrangements for exercise and diet, and he was particularly upset and concerned at the incarceration of young people in such unsuitable conditions. Now, Wilde was admittedly one particularly famous example of many making such comments on the relationship between the prison, health and entitlement of prisoners to decent, healthy and humane conditions. And yet, despite this spotlight in many ways being placed on prisons and on prisoners' health, the prison remains a relatively underexplored site of health by historians. So what our project tries to do, or will do, we're particularly keen to explore the prison as an index or as a barometer of civilization, and an environment in which the human right, as it's often articulated as, to physical and mental health can be severely tested by penal policies and prison conditions. The project, as you can imagine, is quite broad and therefore it covers several research strands. Currently, the aspect that we're looking at the most is the relationship with mental health. So myself and Hilary are working on that with the support of Dr. Nicholas Duval, who's just started his second year of research with us. Then closely related, of course, to that issue is the question of juvenile mental health. And we have a 3-year postdoctoral fellow working with me in UCD, looking at the link between juvenile health and mental illness in England and Ireland for the period. But I suspect a lot of his work will be late 19th into the 20th century. They'll look at that area. We have another recently appointed postdoctoral scholar looking at managing health and disease, so moving away from mental health and looking at disease more generally. At the moment she's refining her project because obviously that could be just huge. And we just very recently appointed, literally this month, she has started a young scholar working with Professor Virginia Burge in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she'll be looking at AIDS and basically drugs and sex in the prison environment. And we also have another project which is looking at political imprisonment and how various political prisoners, how their campaigns, whether they did or did not impact on regimes of health and welfare, and whether they considered ordinary criminals as they carried out their various initiatives. And then we have two other aspects of the project yet to be appointed. One will look at women, health and maternity in prisons, and the other will look at reform, welfare and prisoner health rights, and the role of organisations in advocating for the health of their prisoners during the period. So there are two posts we're hoping to actually fill before September. If anyone's interested, the jobs will be out there. So what are our research questions within this project? Well, we have several, as you can guess, and they're sort of the general list that came from the original grant application, as we were talking about over lunch, but they have, of course, evolved somewhat. But what our research questions, basically, we want to explore key issues that have dogged the prison system from the 1850s, and some of them continue to dog that system today. So just to explore a couple of examples that are relevant for us today, one of our challenges is to explore the ways in which the prison medical officers were constrained by their employment in the prison system, and how much they were seeking to improve conditions of prisons, and by extension the health of prisoners. Did they actually actively advocate for prisoners' health? Or were their roles dominated by the tasks of assessment and the application of prison discipline? For example, ruling on fitness to be punished and to work. This is a constant trope that's used over and over again we see it in the archives. So this is the issue of course, dual loyalty. It is still very much under discussion today, and assessing fitness to work is still a very important aspect of the prison doctor's role. It was very interesting. We had a policy event in London in the Shard where we had current prison doctors, talking about their work. It really made us reflect on actually how we were assessing what was happening in the 19th century, because many of the concerns were really very similar. And so, of course, the prison doctor has to deal with the question of prisoner confidentiality and the duty of the doctor, the ethical duty of the doctor on one hand to his code of practices, and on the other hand his obligation to pass information on to the prison service. So how he manages those ethical questions. But of course the high rates of diagnosis of mental illness, or rather mental health problems, amongst prisoners forms in many ways a red sort of thread from the early 19th century to the present day. And if you look, say, for instance, currently over 70 to 80% of prisoners are currently reported to have at least one mental health problem if you look at English prisons. Now, there are issues around the statistics and how they're developed, but there's no getting away from the consistent concern and debate and reporting on high rates of mental illness among prisoners. Equally, the impact of prison regimes and prison conditions on the mental health of prisoners have been debated from the 1850s onwards. So the complaints about, or the issues of limited exercise, overcrowding, the separate system, which I'll talk about, the solitary system, and more recently the practice of lock-up for extended periods and doubling up in cells, what sort of implications they have for mental health. So the relationship between the prison and the mental hospital is also of huge interest and one we'll be looking at. So for instance, Ian O'Donnell has argued that Ireland's prison population remains small because of the high numbers in psychiatric hospitals, while in England prisons were apparently explicitly utilised at some periods as mental hospitals. So it's this sort of relationship between the two that we're trying to look at. So I'll get on then. Hilary and I are about 19th century historians, so we're terribly intimidated by the mere notion of moving into the 20th century. So we thought we'd start in our comfort zone, which was the 19th century. So here we are. So the paper. And I would like to stress that this is very sort of early stage research. We had periods where we've managed to immerse ourselves in the archives, and then of course have to go and do our day job, i.e. teach. So it's sort of preliminary findings that I'm talking to here today, and every time I think we go back to the material, we have new ideas, new thoughts on it. But I'm sure, as you know, from the inception of the modern prison system in the 19th century, social reformers, policy makers, prison surgeons, prison officers generally have grappled, as I suggested, with relentlessly high levels of mental illness in prison, as prison regimes and conditions were criticised for their impact on the mental well-being of their inmates. Yet while the relationship between mental breakdown and prisons has been widely acknowledged, in terms of prisons admitting large numbers of mentally ill people, and also as institutions that apparently contributed to the production of or aggravated mental disease among prisoners, there has been relatively little detailed work on it. So this paper explores the management of prisoners with mental illness in English and to some extent Irish prisons from the mid to late 19th century, and we draw largely on two examples. One is Liverpool Borough Prison, and then the other example is Mountjoy Prison in Dublin. Okay. But we also are trying to test the relationship between emerging theories of criminal anthropology and prison practice. And I think that's what we're particularly interested in, is practice within the prison environment. And in particular, testing Garland's assertion that British criminology can be best understood by concentrating less on the impact of ideas from abroad and how they sort of came into the British system, and more on the ways in which penal institutions acted as a practical surface of emergence for this kind of knowledge. So less on this movement of ideas into Britain and Ireland, but rather how things were operating within the prison itself, and particularly within prison practice. So we look at how dealing with mentally ill prisoners became a significant part of prison officers' workload. It was, of course, a threat to the order, discipline and governance of prisons, and a drain on the prison services. Many prisoners were transferred to expensive county lunatic asylums, moved to invalid prisons, while those whose insanity was doubted, the malingerers, remained in or were returned to the prison system itself. And the prison authorities were unable in many cases to decide, or indeed even agree on, a prisoner's state of mind, and resisted making transfers to criminal and county asylums, though of course the criminal, as we know, criminal asylums were opened in both Britain and England and Ireland in the period I'm covering. But they were reluctant to move them because of considerations of cost, obviously, but also as it indicated the failure of the institution to in fact manage its prisoners. And also through record linkage, we have been able to follow a small number of prisoners who were transferred from the system to local asylums, and we tried to map their changing status as prisoners to patients or criminal lunatics, and in some cases their eventual return again to the prison system. So it's they move around a lot, shall we say. So what type of source material are we looking at? Well, I guess the key thing to think about when we're looking at this source material, and it perhaps explains why nobody's done this study in a very focused way, is of course that they are very fragmented, very scattered. There isn't a nice sort of neat collection of sources sitting in a nice archive waiting for us to fall upon. So the paper draws on a diverse and underexploited set of archives on the health of prisoners, and these include official papers such as the Prison Commissioners and Prison Inspectors' annual reports, but also the English Home Office records and the Irish General Prison Office papers. They also include, where they have survived, individual prison minute books, and of course they don't always survive. And sometimes when they do, they're terribly disappointing because they're talking about systems and they're not talking about the prisoners. Medical literature, of course, the publications of penologists, and then when they survive, the lunatic asylum case books. And it's through connecting all these records that we've managed actually to try and track some individual prisoners as they move through the prison system, through the asylums, and sometimes, as I said, back again. So the prison system, prison reform, sorry, too early. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with this story, so I won't dwell on it too long. But the prison system that was put in place in the mid-19th century was, of course, the culmination of many years of thinking about the relationship between punishment and reformation, and experimentation with penitentiary regimes and architecture. Its roots, as we know, can be found in the work of campaigners who aimed to improve prison conditions, notably John Howard and Elizabeth Fry. But they were not only horrified at the systematic abuses they found in local jails and the appalling lack of hygiene, but also critical of the ineffective nature of existing forms of prison punishment. Howard, as we know, also commented on the high number of people with mental illness in prison and the poor care prisoners received there. And these are just two quotations taken from his 1784 publication. But by the early 19th century, various regimes were developed by evangelicals and spiritual reformers, which stressed the importance of separate system in the prison and of reflection and prayer for reform. So as they were sort of formulating these new ideas of how the prison, what form the prison should take place, and the role of reformation within this, there was a lot of support for these evangelical and spiritual ideas. And these theories became very influential, and proponents actively shaped policy and practice. So they really had a very significant impact on actually what was carried out within the prisons. And of course, the most famous examples of these are William Crawford and the Reverend William Whitworth Russell, who would eventually become the key proponents of the separate system, and they would be very, very involved, as we will see, in the promotion of the separate system in Pentonville. Now, people like Russell and Crawford and other spiritual reformers were very opposed to alternative systems, particularly those that promoted industrial profitable labour, such as that in place in Preston in Lancashire, and also the silence system. And this is the system where basically the individuals were kept, they were allowed to associate at certain times, but at all other times they were to be completely silent. It was in place in the Cold Baths Field in London, but also in the Auburn prison in New York. And that allowed, as I said, for associated labour on the grounds that they were opposed to these ones that allowed for associated labour on the grounds that under these regimes, prisoners were distracted from reflection and true reformation. So they really wanted to maximise that period alone for reflection. And as you know, the purest form of this system and the purest expression of Crawford's and Russell's separate system was introduced at the model prison in Pentonville in London when it opened in 1842. Though it was, of course, experimented with a little bit beforehand at Millbank with disastrous consequences. Nonetheless, they carried on. And Pentonville is our best example that allows us to explore the relationship between prison regimes, discipline, and the mind and mental breakdown. While intended to improve both the morals and mental capacity of prisoners through education and religious teaching and exhortation, Pentonville became the site of high levels of mental disorder, mania, delusion, and depression. As we know from other scholars' work, Pentonville was expected to work or to operate like a machine with every minute of the convict's day, from the first bell at 5:30 a.m. until lights out at 9 p.m, regimented, directed, and observed in meticulous detail, whether at work, exercise, or indeed in the chapel. Prisoners were not to communicate to each other, but worked, ate, and slept in their cells, spending almost 23 hours of each day there. They were moved through the prison with their faces covered by masks or hood, seated in chapel in separate stalls. That's the usual image used for the chapel, in closed stalls, while exercise took place in separate airing yards. The period of separate confinement at Pentonville was set at 18 months. So you're to spend 18 months in this period to allow for the full application of probation, instruction and reflection. The key thing about Pentonville is that prisoners were to be carefully selected. So it wasn't just any old prisoner who was allowed in. They were to be first offenders in theory, in good health, physical and mental. They're to be aged between 18 and 35, and they were to be fit, and this word is key, fit for reform and for the regime. Now within this system, the prison chaplains were the key figures in communicating with prisoners. They were able to assert themselves in matters of the mind, claiming that they had the closest oversight and the most intimate contact with individual prisoners, with the ability to know and understand their states of mind. So they're asserting themselves as the expert in relation to a prisoner's mind. A key advocate of the system was, of course, Reverend Clay, who was chaplain at Preston Prison. And this is his description of it. He described how solitude was a terrible solvent. A few months in the solitary cell renders a prisoner strangely impressionable. The chaplain can then make the brawny Narvie cry like a child. He can work on his feelings in almost any way he pleases and fill his mouth with his own phrases and language. So this idea that the chaplain, and through solitary confinement and through reflection, can break down the prisoner to allow them the opportunity to be built back up again, of course, through education, etc. Almost immediately on the opening of Pentonville, a considerable number of cases of depression, insanity, mania and hallucinations presented among the Pentonville prisoners, many of a religious tone, threatening to disrupt the prison regime and questioning the evangelicist approach of the prison chaplain. While the Pentonville commissioners, and the commissioners included Russell and Crawford, while the Pentonville commissioners appear to have downplayed the cases of mental illness in published reports and appeared to resist transfers to the wing for criminal lunatics in Bethlehem Asylum in London, the medical officers' reports, the minute books and the chaplain's journals show very high instance of mental disorder, disrupting the order of the prison and undermining the separation regime itself. However, prison authorities insisted that the prison was largely effective in protecting the minds of prisoners rather than driving them insane. They argued that the system was quite effective in protecting them, maintaining that cases of insanity did not result from separate confinement, but were the consequence of earlier episodes of mental breakdown, and more specifically of a family history of insanity. So this became a particular concern, to identify the family history. The high rates of insanity among prisoners in separate confinement eventually influenced the decision to significantly modify the system after 1847. So what happened in 1847 is basically Crawford and Russell die quite suddenly. So the Pentonville commissioners, of the commissioners, the two who really advocated for the system were Crawford and Russell. Jebb and others had sort of doubts. But once Crawford and Russell die quite suddenly in the same year, essentially the system is modified quite quickly. And by 1853, the solitary period, which was originally the idea was to be 18 months, had been reduced to 9 months. So it's halved steadily after their deaths. Yet, while the purest form of separate system was essentially a failed experiment, modified forms were, as we know, introduced to English and Irish and further afield prisons throughout the 1850s in purpose-built prisons and through the complex government of the convict system. And as we know, separation would remain the basis of prison discipline during the remainder of the 19th century. Yet its application was, of course, patchy across Ireland and England. While some prisons, such as those at Reading, Bedford, Bath, Mountjoy in Dublin and Pentonville, reported that the separate system was fully carried out, in many other prisons implementation was partial or it was not implemented at all. So it's it really depends on which prison you're looking at. In Lancashire, the influence of John Clay, who we've seen, was a vocal and ardent supporter of the separate system. His influence persuaded the newly appointed Lancashire visiting justices to introduce the system at Preston and at Kirkdale in Liverpool after 1846. So even as it's in its decline, he's advocating for it to be introduced in the prisons of Lancashire. Richard Appleton, who was the chaplain at Kirkdale prison, observed that under the system, quote, all contamination being thereby prevented and everything around the criminal being calculated to lead him to serious and pious thoughts and good resolutions for the time to come, I do not see any tendency in it to overthrow or even enfeeble the mind. So as it's being criticised and as it's sort of unravelling in Pentonville, he's still arguing that it is a successful system. As I said, however, a feature of the late 19th century of these other prisons established was reports of high rates of mental distress among prisoners, while officials remained alert to and defensive about links being made between prison regimes and prisoners' damaged minds. Many continued to deny that the prison system was the cause. But Michael Cody, who was the Roman Catholic chaplain at Mountjoy, insisted in his 1869 annual report that to subject the prisoners to the separate system for 8 months is calculated to injuriously affect them mentally as well as physically. The directors of the convict system rejected his claim. They actually annotated the annual report, the published version, stating that the directors do not concur with these opinions. So there's clearly quite a strong difference of opinion. And of course, outside critics also disagreed. Dr. Forbes Winslow, who we know is quite a prominent forensic alias in this period, he suggested that he looked at Pentonville and he suggested that 14% of prisoners suffered some kind of mental disorder in 1851, and he related it closely to the regime. So the two prisons we look at in a little more detail are the New Borough jail, which was built and finally opened in Liverpool in 1855. It took a few years, as you can see there, to finish. And also then Mountjoy, which is often referred to as Ireland's model prison, or our version of Pentonville, which was opened in Dublin in 1850. Both of these prisons were designed and built for the implementation of separate confinement, even at this period after the death of Crawford and Russell. Liverpool, with provision for 1,000, as you can see it's very large, 1,000 prisoners, functioned as both a local and a convict repository. It's actually quite complicated, the prison system in this period. And Mountjoy was initially opened as a convict prison for just under 500 male prisoners, and then in 1858 a separate women's prison was opened on its site, and then in the 1870s it takes in local prisons as well, so it loses its convict status. In both of these locations, the mental condition of prisoners became a matter of concern almost immediately. At Mountjoy, the medical officer, Francis Rind, repeatedly rejected large numbers of prisoners sent there after he had conducted the most careful and painstaking selection. He rejected them as unfit for the separate system on the ground of their poor mental and physical health. In his first visit to the New Borough Jail at Liverpool in 1856, the prison inspector Herbert Voles reported on 2 prisoners who had been already removed to local lunatic asylums, a 12-year-old boy who had committed suicide after 3 weeks in confinement, a male prisoner who threw himself from an upper gallery, and a female prisoner who tried to hang herself in her cell. The latter 2 survived, and they were discharged at the end of their sentences. Boyle also insisted that 6 other prisoners had feigned attempts to hang themselves, and I'll go back to this issue later on, with a view to procure their removal from the separate system. Now, assessing, as you can probably guess, assessing and managing these disorderly patients was a significant drain on the resources of the prison. While in Pentonville in the 1840s, the prison chaplain was the self-declared expert in matters relating to the prisoners' minds. But from the 1850s in Liverpool, the Liverpool and Mountjoy prison doctors were also deeply involved and spent a great deal of their time investigating cases of mental disorder within each prison, organising removals to other institutions, looking out for signs of feigning. And according to Stephen Watson, it was through these observations that medical officers could claim expertise in diagnosing cases of moral defects. Due to the sheer size of Liverpool, the visiting justices actually advised the chaplains that they should, in a friendly, unofficial way, bring the surgeon's attention to any of these cases. So because Liverpool was so big, a lot of the staff were involved in this. But by this period, by the 1850s, it's to the surgeon's attention they need to be brought, not to the chaplain. And yet, what's striking about it is the relatively low number of prisoners being sent to actual lunatic asylums. So if we look at 1864, only one prisoner at Liverpool, John Murray, was transferred to asylum. And two others had actually in the same year attempted to hang themselves, while a further 5 male and 1 female prisoner actually showed signs of insanity. But out of that list, only one is sent to an asylum. The woman was returned to her husband, while all the 5 men were removed to Brownlow workhouse, the local workhouse. And then again, if we look at the year 1877, at the end of that year, 9 prisoners were removed to 3 Lancashire asylums in that year. So the actual number of transfers are kept low. And one such example, and he's very typical of our cases, was Thomas Jones. He was a 29-year-old married labourer who was transferred from Liverpool Borough Asylum to Liverpool Borough Jail to Rainhill Asylum in April 1877. On admission, Jones was described as being dangerous to others and diagnosed with mania and general paralysis. He managed the Queen, was his grandmother. Physically, his body was very stout, but he was weak and shaky, obviously general paralysis. There were signs of past and current violence. He had old scars on his face and head and a bruise below his left eye. His expression was described as stupid. As I said, there were a lot of investigations into these cases, and in this case, the prison doctors decided there was a family history of insanity, as both his brother and father had been in asylums. Jones had been in Liverpool jail at least 3 other times, and usually for larceny. And on this occasion, his trial was actually postponed due to the state of his mind. When in Rainhill, his condition steadily deteriorated. The morning of his admission, he became restless and mischievous. He claimed he was a coach builder by trade, owning over 3,000 shops. So he had quite definite delusions. But by May, he was dirty in his habits, very destructive of his clothing, constantly eating rubbish and daubing himself with excrement. And he would eventually die in Rainhill in November 1878. And Jones is quite typical of the examples we're coming across. Now, the question I suppose we have to leave is, well, what has this got to do with the regimes in the prisons? And it's unclear in many ways whether and how these cases are linked to the separate system. Sorry, that's his casebook, by the way, that we found in Rainhill Asylum, so when we link the two together. So it's rather unclear in many ways how these are linked to the separate system. At Liverpool, attempts were made sometimes to mitigate the system or to ease the system if mental illness was detected among prisoners. The Governor Anderson, observed that in the number of persons who are from time to time committed to this prison, there are some who are predisposed to insanity, or whose minds are weak, or who are or whose minds are weak, or who are subject to delusions or to other affectations, and it is very probable that separate confinement may have a tendency to cause such maladies to be more fully developed. So he's sort of saying, well, if they come in with some latent possibility of it, the condition can actually make it worse. Whenever such cases occur, he went on, the prisoner is closely watched and the surgeon's opinion immediately taken. And when necessary, the prisoner is removed from the cell to work in association during the day, and if requisite, other prisoners sleep in the same cell during the night. So they definitely modified the system to deal with these cases. Due, however, to overcrowding in the prison, especially on the female side, separate system, that's Governor Anderson's quote, I do apologise. Due to overcrowding in the asylum, especially on the female side, separate confinement was never fully or consistently implemented in the jail, though it appears to have remained the intention of its officers and its visiting justices. And just to get a sense of how big Liverpool was, by 1865 the prison was admitting around 9,000 prisoners a year, and almost half of these were women. So it's quite unusual in that respect. And by the early 1890s, Liverpool Prison was committing almost 20,000 prisoners, and most of these on short sentences. So the pressure increases onto them. And the number of female prisoners became a particular matter of concern. So in 1864, the governor reported that on the female side, every year except one, more prisoners than could be provided for in separate confinement were admitted. So there is this tension between their ability to actually implement separate confinement and also between their ability to do it and the pressure of numbers on the system. And it's particularly acute on the female side of the prison. Nonetheless, the regime at Liverpool was reportedly harsh. Okay, so in 1864, the chaplain Thomas Carter called for the separate system to be made more deterrent, particularly in the case of old or repeat offenders, to try and reduce the number of committals. The effect of the new prison rules, which were introduced in December 1869, were described by the visiting justices as to make the earlier stages of imprisonment much more penal than formerly. So there's this shift away from the reformative to the penal. And when the justices were making these comments about how much more penal the system was becoming, the prison surgeon assured them that the enforcement of these rules had no ill effect upon the general health of the prisoners. So the prison surgeon is sort of supporting the enforcement of these penal regulations. And so by 1868 the treadmill was in full operation in Liverpool, with prisoners spending 6 to 7 hours on it. Some chaplains were opposed to the treadmill due to its physical effects, which can result in serious injury and cause much anxiety. But the prison surgeon, however, who was responsible for certifying whether prisoners were fit to go on the treadmill, he commented that, quote, "I do not think upon the whole it has prejudicially affected the gelato of the prisoners. Persons of a weak frame of body and those encumbered with unnecessary amount of fat, of course, feel it the most." So he's sort of saying, unless you're actually quite able for it. And what we know, though, from the archives are the number of accidents that happened on the treadmills. So, for instance, in Mountjoy, in the 1860 file I was looking at about 2 weeks ago, 2 different prisoners were killed through accidents on the treadmill. But nonetheless, Governor Jackson at Liverpool was confident that the treadmill phase of punishment already proved a deterrent to the old thieves, and if it has not reformed them, it has had the effect of getting rid of a number who I have been informed have cleared out of Liverpool. So it's a deterrent. The regime at Mountjoy was quite slightly different. When it opened in 1850, the modified version of the separate system, which was then in use in Pentonville, was introduced. But again, very quickly, medical officers were engaged in managing and assessing cases of mental distress and attempted suicide. So in 1854 alone, there were at least 3 cases of suicide reported to the general prison officer, because they're obliged to report them up. From 1854, Sir Walter Crofton's much lauded Mark or Irish system was introduced to the prison. This was a sort of a system that was meant, or certainly was claimed, that it reduced the cases of mental health. Under it, men were kept in separate system for 8 months and women for 4, and then prisoners were placed on public work schemes in association, and they were rewarded for their labour. Okay, so that's what the mark system were. They were given certain rewards for working. The system was praised with claims that prolonged use of separate confinement can only weaken the offender's moral and mental stamina. It was also praised for ensuring that there were what was called no belly bribes in the Irish system. And this was a clear criticism of the English convict system, where Josiah Jebb, sort of insisted that actual prisoners be given a diet, a decent diet, to help them withstand the treadmill and the other parts of the regime. So they're clearly criticising Clay, and it's Clay again who's criticising this English system as being too easy. While supporters claimed Mountjoy's prisoners exhibited lower rates of mental illness under the mark system, critics, which included its own staff members, were decidedly less enthusiastic. Dr. Young, who was the MO, maintained that the separate system aggravated prisoners' mental disorders. He knew of, quote, few places more calculated to defeat this end, i.e. the reform of prisoners, than Mountjoy prison, where its gloomy appearance, peculiar construction, and surrounded as it is by such high walls, cannot fail to exercise a depressing influence on the minds of such a class. So how did they deal with them? Well, certainly so far what we found in Liverpool is that for some prisoners they were transferred to local asylums. But there was a reluctance on behalf of the authorities to do this. And in the process, while they were deciding whether they would do it, they conducted quite detailed investigations that were reportedly revealed past histories of asylum admissions, previous attacks, but also hereditary insanity. One such case, I'll just use one of these, was the case of Martin Ambrose, who was a 33-year-old Irish labourer who was admitted in October 1895. Again, he's suffering from general paralysis, and he was experiencing his first attack of insanity when he was 25. He had been in the Navy, but had been discharged after 6 years, physically unfit, suffering from paralysis. He then moved to Liverpool with his father, hawking bootlaces. But his father had turned him out of the house at the previous Christmas, and since then he wandered around the city. He had been committed to Liverpool jail 9 months earlier for being in possession of stolen timber. And again, he died of general paralysis in the asylum after he was moved. So these are the type of cases. I mean, they're just examples of them. As I said, the other thing that the prison officers were obliged to keep a close eye on, or kept a close eye on, were investigations into attempts at suicide, which were actually very common, but were often dismissed as shamming or feigning, and prisoners were often punished. So in 1864, 2 male prisoners at Liverpool made attempts to hang themselves though the governor claimed that neither had any intention of injuring himself. One, again, was moved to Millbank Prison, which is sometimes used in an invalid prison, and the other, charged with deserting his regiment, was actually removed by escort. In December 1889, Thomas Bradley, who was a prisoner at Liverpool, he was serving 18 months for burglary, and he'd already had 2 strokes with the rod, was charged with disturbing the prison by shouting. The case was brought before the visiting justices, and evidence of 2 wardens and a prison surgeon was heard. Bradley claimed he could not help his shouting, and he could not keep his mouth shut, and that he put his handkerchief in his mouth to try and stop it. And this is apparently his attempted suicide, that he tried to choke himself. Hammond, however, swore that the prisoner was of sound mind. I do not believe his excuses. He is fit to undergo the punishment of the cat, and Bradley was ordered to have 18 lashes with it. So it's quite a punitive response. At Mountjoy, in most cases of attempted suicide, prisoners were put in handcuffs, placed on a punishment diet, and transferred then to the penal ward. One especially incorrigible case was convict David Simmons, who in 1860 reportedly feigned suicide on 3 different occasions in 1 year, and I think he had a previous history of it. He was repeatedly placed on the punishment diet, which he would then refuse to eat, and that in turn would result to his transfer to the hospital. And there he would essentially admit that he was feigning to the doctor. So there he is fully admitted to me, said Dr. MacDonald, that he has no intention of hanging himself. Yesterday he laughed and turned the matter into ridicule. I asked that his handcuffs be taken off, as he had no intention of injuring himself. And what's interesting about this case, Simmons, is this is his pattern. He does this 3 times. That basically he goes into hospital, he refuses to eat the punishment diet until he's moved into hospital. He stays there under observation, then he admits that he's feigning, then he's brought back into the separate system, and he does it all over again. In some of these cases, the Inspector of Lunacy, George Hatchell, was requested to come in and assess them. But again, we see the prisons and the prison officers seldom authorise their removal to an asylum. And at this stage, Dundrum, which is the criminal lunatic asylum, is open. Now, for Liverpool, a particularly difficult problem for them were actually female prisoners. And in this respect, Liverpool is exceptional, both in its number of Irish prisoners, because of course it's a point of migration, but also the sheer number of female prisoners. Between 1864 and 1879, 65% of those committed to jail were Catholic, and 8 out of 10 of these were Irish-born, or the children of Irish-born parents. And the Irish preponderance was extenuated among women, and Liverpool was one of the only prisons in the world where the female prisoners exceeded the male. And of course, as a port city, very few of these, there were few opportunities, according to the prison minister, James Nugent, for female labour, so that the destitute and the friendless girl is repeatedly allured into the path of crime. A large seaport, it became the general refuge of the vicious and the fallen. Women were admitted to prison on charges of prostitution or being drunk and disorderly, and some were committed 30, 40, 50 or even 60 times on, of course, short-term sentences. So they're short-term prisoners. In 1871, one woman who'd been in the prison 6 times in the last quarter attained her 105th commitment. And as Nugent and as the governor sort of became quite concerned about these, they noted that the greater part of these poor creatures are thoroughly hardened in crime and, humanly speaking, utterly unredeemable. There are some cases, however, where the parties are comparatively young in their career crimes, in which great and lasting good may be done. So they're clearly dividing between those that are redeemable and those that aren't. For many of these women, the cost of passage back to Ireland was paid, but often they reappeared back into the Liverpool system. So they would be paid to return, and then they'd pop back up again. In the 1890s, the Prison Visitors Committee wrote in desperation to the Home Secretary to intervene, to remedy, and if possible, extinguish this great disgrace of our age. And though redeemable measures such as reformatories and migration were muted, medical explanations of the incorrigibility of such women increasingly suggested that their behaviour was the result of some pathological condition rather than any ill will. Longer sentences were muted by the Liverpool Visiting Committee, though they feared there would be difficulty agreeing to a proposal that criminals, like lunatics, could be detained until they are cured. So the curability of these women is questioned. And one example of that is, again, this woman, Cheswick or Charlotte Oakley. Her name shifts across the two. She was regarded as a particularly troublesome woman. The first complaint against her that we can find for insubordination was made in March 1888. And in October of that same year, the governor of the prison observed that the inspector of lunatics had actually suggested there might be something wrong with her state of mind. The case, she was referred to back to the medical officer, but nothing seems to have happened in 1888. And then over the next 2 years, Oakley made a series of requests to the visiting committee and was repeatedly brought before them for violent behaviour. In March 1889, so a year later, she applied to be sent to a convent at Manchester. And she also applied a year later to have her sentence shortened. August 1892, the governor charged her with mischievous behaviour after many previous punishments. So she had this long history of behavioural problems. On this occasion, she appeared before the visiting justices and she was reported to be very noisy and violent. One warder swore that she saw the prisoner break the bolt off the door of her cell, while another saw the prisoner strike the doctor. The prisoner just laughed, so Oakley apparently laughed and made a great noise when asked what she had to say. And in this case, she was ordered to be kept in a confinement cell for 4 days with her hands fastened behind her. But it wasn't until June 1893, so 5 years after the first suggestion of insanity was made, that the visiting committee sent her to Rainhill Asylum. But it took until September before she was actually transferred there. And at that point, she was 35 years of age, described as intemperate, dangerous to others, cunning and untruthful, and suffering, as the diagnosis was given, was mania. She was released in September 1894 from the asylum, but was back in Liverpool jail in February 1895. And again, she was brought before the committee to examine her state of mind. In that case, it was found she was actually sane, and they didn't certify her, but then she appeared again before them in April 1895, and this time she was found insane and was transferred to another asylum, the Whittingham. And then we see her readmitted again, so she was released at some point from Whittingham and she's readmitted to Rainhill Asylum in November 1896. And on that occasion she's described in the casebook as an alcoholic and a disorderly prostitute. And then finally she's moved to another asylum further away, and she's basically moved there as not improved in April 1911. And that's the last we have of her. So she's this troublesome character for the prison and for the asylum authorities, and she's moving in and out of the systems. So in terms of theories, well, as we know, by the late 1860s, there was a broad shift towards considering prisoners as the dangerous classes incapable of reform, and towards the position that the reformist basis of the borough and county prisons was erroneous. So by the 1860s, faced with these type of prisoners, there's this hardening, Forsyth has certainly suggested, hardening of attitudes. Stephen Watson has suggested that knowledge of these mentally deficient criminals was a product of the prison procedures that we've just seen. Their procedures for observing, for classifying, and for segregating prisoners. And in this process, the meaning of the phrase fit for punishment, which was repeatedly used, came to be an assessment on the prisoner's mental state. The weak-minded became the unfit. So it's not so much their physical fitness the officers are assessing, it's their mental fitness. Yet institutions like Liverpool Jail were in many ways overwhelmed by the scale of the numbers. And even in prisons that were not overcrowded, such as Mountjoy for instance, prison medical officers affirmed how difficult it was to distinguish the criminal from the lunatic. They broadly acknowledged, even as they exerted their expertise in dealing with lunatic asylums, that mental illness was exceedingly difficult to define, to distinguish, and indeed to deal with. Sorry. So, as I said, conversely in Dublin, you have a very different context, but they're making the same observations. So Robert MacDonald, who we've encountered at Mountjoy, when he was reporting on one prisoner in 1860, prisoner Thomas Doyle, he observed, "I beg to state that I have for some time carefully observed this individual and considered his case. I do not think him a fit subject for punishment. He belongs to that class of cases which are unquestionably of a nature most difficult for a medical man to deal with. A character cunning, deceitful, passionate, and impatient of control, yet in my judgment having naturally bad disposition, complicated by a certain admixture of disease, which tends to make the mind more fretful, irritable, and uncontrollable. I conceive that such disease should be treated as firmly, yet as gently as the circumstances in the case will admit. And I therefore do not think that such a case as that of Doyle can be properly met by punishment. But nor do I think he is suited for the discipline of this system, of this prison." And here essentially he's referring to what he more explicitly says later is his weak-minded status. So it's this role that they're assessing. So fit for punishment and unable to withstand the regime was essentially that they were referring to them as weak-minded. So then to return to Garland's argument, which I mentioned at the beginning, this uncertainty about diagnosis and interest in individual cases, alongside a focus on the practical aspects of prison management, mitigated against the impact of the continental theories on the criminal anthropologists, notably Lambrusco. Rather than focusing on criminal types in England and in Ireland, there was more interest in observing the prisoner's response to discipline and previous convictions. In other words, habituals and recidivists. And of course, for the medical officers themselves, they want to do more than just administer this system. They're interested in creating these case stories and case notes, so they want to be part of observing for their own professional identity. Nonetheless, in the 1860s and the 1870s, a number of articles appeared in medical journals aimed at trying to pin down the mental defects of criminals, some of which concluded that there were criminal types. So if we look at some of the publications, for instance, of James Bruce, who was in Perth in Scotland, and David Nichols, who was at Portsmouth and later in charge of Broadmoor, they tried to publish in the 60s, or they published in the 60s and 70s, tried to understand that. But you see them sort of changing in attitude, and towards the end of the century they become more hardened in their responses to it. But for instance, if we look at Dr. Thomas Laycott of Edinburgh University, he argued at a meeting that the habitual and incorrigible criminal was essentially unreformable, a class of people numbering tens of thousands, so constituted corporally that they possess no self-control beyond that of an ordinary brute. They less than a well-bred horse or dog. They are for the most part immoral imbeciles. So while most of the literature has argued that Lambrusco and others had a very limited impact on the British and was actually, some would argue, was responded to in quite a hostile way, what's interesting here is they seem to be developing similar ideas, but from prison practice, or some of them are developing prisoner ideas from prison practice. So just to conclude then, I suppose Liverpool is of course a particular case. as a port city with a large migrant, usually Irish population, who made up a huge proportion of what was a vast prison population. They added to the difficulties of implementation of separate system, also given the fact that many sentences were short, and the scale of operations in Liverpool is likely to have promoted a more penal approach and led to frustration in imposing the separate system. As the prison population expanded, practice appears to have been governed by the view that many of these prisoners straddled the borders between madness and badness and needed to be cured. And they use this phrase quite a few times. Longer and more deterrent sentences were therefore advocated by Liverpool's visiting justices. However, in both settings, prisoners, rather than the prison discipline and its system, were blamed for the mental disorders of prisoners. Though we see a shift in the late 19th century from associating individual cases with previous insanity or the mental illness of family members to more pathological explanations involving groups of criminals prone through environment and hereditary, both the explanations were invoked, to crime, drunkenness and or mental instability and weakness. So while the anthropological approach to criminality was not referred to in Liverpool or indeed in Mountjoy, and one would imagine that its hard-pressed officers were likely not familiar with the publications of Lambrusco and his colleagues on criminal types, in practice you can see that they were developing quite similar conclusions. And the other factor, I suppose, that's in this mix somewhere was, of course, the financial cost of removals of the mentally ill to asylums. We've seen their reluctance, and in many ways that financial cost was probably not huge because they only transferred quite a small number. So they resisted implementing transfers in many cases. And also the relationships with neighbouring asylums often became quite difficult because, of course, those asylums were overcrowded, they were overstretched, and a lot of the actual medical officers of asylums were very critical of the state prisoners arrived in. And they in fact argued, one or two argued, that the transfers from prisons were having a very damaging effect on their mortality rates. In other words, when they made their annual reports, that these prisoners were actually damaging their statistics, or how they represented themselves in the statistics. But they didn't actually want them for many reasons. But nonetheless, the costs of these prisoners in terms of time, difficulties in maintaining order, and reputational damage was significant and even enduring. So thank you.